You ever notice how the wind lies on this range? The old man's voice was low and rough, like gravel under a boot, and for a moment nobody answered because nobody had expected him to speak at all. The Marine training range at Camp Ridley stretched nearly a mile across sunburned California earth, heat shimmering above the dusty ground as a line of young Marines adjusted gear and checked instruments that blinked with quiet digital confidence. Flags snapped on thin poles marking wind shifts every few hundred yards, their movements confusing even the newest ballistic software, and the morning sun hung bright and hard in a pale sky that promised a long day of drills. At the edge of the range, just beyond the metal bleachers and stacked ammo crates, an old man stood with his hands tucked calmly into the pockets of a faded olive jacket that looked older than most of the Marines training there. His white hair moved slightly in the breeze while his pale blue eyes studied the range with patient attention, the kind of attention that came from decades of watching small details other people missed. Most of the Marines had ignored him when he first appeared near the fence line 30 minutes earlier, assuming he was a retired base worker or a lost visitor who had wandered too far into restricted training grounds. But Captain Ryan Walker noticed everything that didn't belong in his carefully controlled environment, and the old man standing quietly behind his firing line definitely did not belong. Walker was 31 years old, tall, precise, and proud of the silver bars on his collar, the kind of Marine officer who believed discipline and modern training had already solved most problems the past had struggled to understand. He turned slowly toward the stranger now, folding his arms as a few nearby Marines glanced over with mild curiosity. The old man hadn't moved from his spot beside the fence, still watching the wind flags like they were telling him a story nobody else could hear. Walker walked toward him across the gravel, boots crunching sharply with each step, and stopped a few feet away with the polite impatience of someone who expected instant explanations. "Range is restricted today," he said, his voice even but edged with authority. "You looking for somebody, sir?" The old man's eyes shifted from the distant flags to the captain's face, calm and unbothered. "Just watching the wind," he said quietly. A few Marines nearby chuckled under their breath, and Walker tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the answer. "Watching the wind," he repeated. "That's so." The old man gave a small nod, turning his gaze back across the range where the flags twisted in 3 different directions at once. "Wind tells you more than people think," he murmured. Walker smirked faintly, glancing at the Marines behind him who were now paying closer attention to the exchange. "You served before?" he asked. The old man paused for a moment, the faintest hint of a memory passing behind his eyes before it disappeared again. "Long time ago," he said. Walker studied him another second, amused now, the way young officers sometimes were when confronted with quiet confidence they didn't quite understand. "Well," the captain said with a half grin that carried across the range, "every Marine had a call sign back in the day." He leaned forward slightly, voice light with sarcasm as a few Marines gathered closer to listen. "So tell me something, old-timer," Walker said. "What was yours?" The question hung in the warm morning air like a challenge thrown across the range, and the Marines nearby leaned in slightly, as if the answer might be worth hearing. Captain Ryan Walker stood with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he already understood how the moment would end, one hand resting casually on his belt, while the other gestured toward the distant firing lanes where wind flags twisted restlessly in the shifting breeze. The old man did not answer immediately. Instead, he kept watching the range, his pale blue eyes tracking the subtle motion of the flags, the shimmer of heat rising off the packed earth, the faint ripple of air moving through the dry grass along the berm nearly 800 yards away. To the Marines gathered behind the captain, it looked like hesitation, like the quiet confusion of someone caught in a joke he did not understand. A few of them exchanged smirks. One young lance corporal shifted his rifle sling and whispered something that drew a low chuckle from the group. Walker noticed the reaction and allowed the moment to stretch another few seconds, enjoying the quiet attention that settled over the firing line. "What is the matter?" he asked lightly. "Do not remember?" The old man's expression did not change. The sun glinted softly off the worn zipper of his jacket as he breathed in the dry California air and finally turned his head back toward the captain. Up close his face showed the long map of years spent outdoors, weathered skin and deep lines that carried the quiet patience of someone who had seen many mornings like this one. "It has been a long time," he said. His voice was steady, neither defensive nor proud, simply stating a fact. Walker shrugged slightly and looked over his shoulder at the Marines who had now gathered within easy listening distance. "Well, let us help you remember," he said with an amused grin. Every Marine had one. Some of them were ridiculous. Some of them sounded tough. But everybody had a call sign. He stepped a little closer, the gravel crunching under his boots. "So come on," he said, lowering his voice just enough to draw the circle of listeners tighter. "What did they call you?" The old man's eyes moved once more across the training field. The wind had shifted again, subtly bending the third flag near the 700-yard marker while the first two still pointed east. None of the digital weather meters clipped to the Marines' vests seemed to notice. The old man watched it for another moment, as if confirming something only he understood. Then he looked back at the captain. "You really want to know?" he asked quietly. Walker smiled wider. "I asked, did I not?" The Marines behind him waited, several of them folding their arms with the eager curiosity that came whenever an old story might be about to begin. For a long second the old man said nothing. The range seemed oddly quiet despite the distant hum of generators and the occasional clink of metal equipment shifting in the breeze. Even the wind flags fluttered more softly now, as if listening. Finally the old man nodded once, almost to himself. When he spoke, the words were calm and unhurried, the way someone might give a simple answer to a simple question. "Iron Viper," he said. The name landed gently in the air between them. No explanation followed. The old man simply returned his gaze to the range as though the conversation had already ended, leaving the captain and the gathered Marines standing there, with the strange feeling that something important had just passed quietly through the morning without announcing itself. For a few seconds nobody reacted at all. The name simply floated there in the warm air above the range like something that did not quite belong in the present. Captain Ryan Walker blinked once, the smile still hanging on his face as if he expected the old man to add a punchline. When none came, he let out a short laugh that carried easily across the gravel. "Iron Viper," he repeated, drawing out the words with amused disbelief. "That is a pretty dramatic call sign for someone who says it has been a long time." A few of the Marines behind him laughed as well, the tension breaking in the easy way that happens when a group decides a moment must be a joke. One corporal shook his head with a grin while another leaned on a crate of equipment, clearly enjoying the entertainment. Walker lifted his hands slightly, as if presenting the answer to the small crowd gathering around the firing line. "You hear that?" he said. "Iron Viper." The name rolled across the group again, this time accompanied by a ripple of low chuckles. To most of them it sounded like something from an old movie or a half-remembered story from a dusty training manual nobody had opened in years. The captain turned back toward the old man, still smiling, ready to continue the joke. But something in the corner of the range shifted before he could speak again. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed had been standing several yards away beside a rack of spotting scopes, quietly checking wind readings with the calm efficiency of a Marine who had spent enough years in uniform to know when a moment deserved attention. At first he had only half listened to the conversation. A curious visitor on the edge of the range was not unusual. But when the old man spoke those two words, something deep in the back of Reed's mind stirred like a memory waking up after a long sleep. "Iron Viper." The sound of it hit him with a strange weight that made his hand pause over the adjustment knob of the scope he had been calibrating. Slowly he straightened and looked toward the small circle of Marines near the fence. Walker was still talking, his voice relaxed and joking, the laughter of the younger Marines echoing around him. The old man, however, had already turned his eyes back toward the wind flags as if the conversation had finished the moment he gave his answer. Reed studied him carefully now. The faded jacket, the calm posture, the way his eyes moved across the range not like a visitor, but like someone reading invisible signals written in the air itself. A faint chill passed through Reed's chest despite the growing heat of the California morning. He had heard that name before. Not in conversation, not in a joke. It had been printed on a page inside a training archive during a briefing years ago when he was still a new sergeant studying the history of reconnaissance units that operated long before modern satellite feeds and computer-assisted targeting existed. The file had been old and partially restricted, the kind instructors usually skipped over quickly because the stories sounded more like legend than official record. But one detail had stuck with him because of the unusual call sign attached to it. Iron Viper. Reed felt the quiet weight of the memory settle in his mind as he looked again at the old man by the fence. Around him the Marines continued smiling and whispering, unaware that the mood of the morning had just shifted slightly in a way none of them yet understood. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed felt the memory pressing harder against the back of his mind the longer he stared at the old man near the fence. Around him the range returned to its normal rhythm of casual chatter and quiet laughter, but Reed no longer heard most of it. His attention narrowed onto the stranger's calm posture and the way his eyes continued tracking the wind flags, as if the conversation with Captain Walker had never mattered in the first place. Reed slowly set the spotting scope down on the metal table beside him, his movements careful and deliberate. The name still echoed in his thoughts. Iron Viper. It had appeared once in an archived reconnaissance briefing when he was a young Marine learning the older field doctrines that modern training rarely mentioned anymore. The instructor had moved past it quickly, almost dismissively, but Reed remembered the tone in the man's voice when he read the call sign aloud. It had not sounded like a story. It had sounded like a warning about someone who understood the battlefield differently than everyone else. Reed took a slow breath and glanced again toward the group near the fence. Captain Walker was still smiling with relaxed confidence, clearly satisfied that the moment had turned into harmless entertainment for the platoon. One of the younger Marines repeated the call sign again with exaggerated drama, drawing another round of quiet chuckles. The old man did not react to any of it. He remained exactly where he had been from the start, standing quietly with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime letting other people misunderstand him. Reed felt an uneasy pull in his chest. Something about the calmness of that answer had not sounded like a joke. He wiped a bit of dust from his hands and walked toward the small equipment trailer parked behind the observation line. No one paid much attention to him as he stepped inside. The interior was shaded and cool compared to the bright sun outside, filled with stacked gear cases and a small workstation used for recording range data. A rugged laptop sat open on the metal desk, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. Reed closed the trailer door halfway behind him, shutting out most of the noise from the range. For a moment, he hesitated with his hands resting on the keyboard. The thought sounded ridiculous even in his own head. It could not be the same person. The Iron Viper file had been decades old, tied to operations that most Marines only heard about in vague historical references. But the quiet certainty in the old man's voice refused to leave his thoughts. Reed finally leaned forward and began typing into the base archive search system, entering the two words exactly as he remembered them. The computer processed the request for a few seconds before displaying a result that made his shoulders stiffen slightly. The screen showed a restricted historical record flagged with a faded classification tag that had been partially deactivated years earlier. Reed opened the file slowly, his eyes scanning the first lines of the archived report. Call sign, Iron Viper. Unit, United States Marine Reconnaissance. Status, Field Legend. Reed felt the air in the trailer grow strangely still as he read the description beneath it. The document listed training citations, operational notes, and a remark written by a commanding officer from decades earlier. The final line stopped him completely. Current status, presumed retired. Possible survival unknown. Reed stared at the screen for several seconds before slowly leaning back in his chair. Outside the trailer, he could still hear Captain Walker laughing with the other Marines, completely unaware that something from the past had just stepped quietly onto his training range. Inside the equipment trailer, the quiet hum of the laptop sounded louder than it should have. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed remained seated in the metal chair, his eyes locked on the glowing screen as the archived report continued scrolling slowly beneath his fingertips. The file looked older than most of the systems now running the base network, the formatting uneven, the language formal in the way military reports used to be written decades ago. Yet the information inside it felt disturbingly clear. The call sign appeared again and again throughout the document. Iron Viper. Each reference described a reconnaissance Marine known for reading terrain, wind, and movement with an accuracy that had become legendary among units who had trained beside him. Reed felt a faint tightening in his chest as he read the short evaluation written by an officer whose rank insignia alone suggested the seriousness of the record. The line was simple and almost understated. Subject demonstrates situational awareness beyond conventional field measurement. Command recommendation: treat observational input as operational intelligence. Reed leaned closer to the screen. A few additional notes followed, brief descriptions of training exercises where other units reportedly relied on the Marine with that call sign to interpret environmental conditions no equipment had detected. The reports never exaggerated. They did not need to. The quiet confidence in the writing suggested that the people who recorded these events had simply accepted the results as fact. Reed slowly exhaled and closed the file halfway, staring at the dim reflection of his own face on the screen. Outside the trailer, the sound of casual conversation drifted through the thin metal walls. Captain Walker was still speaking with the younger Marines, his voice confident and amused, as if the morning had delivered a harmless story to pass the time before the next drill. Reed rubbed his forehead with his thumb, thinking through what he had just read. The Iron Viper record had been written nearly 40 years ago. The final status entry had listed the Marine as retired with no confirmed follow-up data after discharge. According to the archive, the individual would now be well into his 80s if he were still alive. Reed sat motionless for several seconds as that realization settled in. Then he quietly reopened the file and scrolled to the personnel summary. The photograph attached to the record was faded and grainy, taken decades earlier, showing a much younger Marine standing beside a reconnaissance team briefing board. The man in the picture had dark hair, sharper features, and the confident posture of someone who understood exactly where he belonged. But the eyes were the same. Calm, observant, unbothered by attention. Reed felt the weight of the comparison sink slowly into his thoughts. The old man standing beside the range fence looked older, of course. Time had carved lines into his face and turned his hair white. But the expression had not changed. Reed closed the laptop halfway and leaned back in his chair, staring toward the trailer door as if he could see through it. The laughter outside had faded slightly now as the Marines began preparing for the next firing rotation. Captain Walker's voice carried across the range again, confident and steady, still unaware that the quiet visitor he had been joking with might actually be the same Marine described in the decades-old record. Reed knew one thing for certain. If the man outside truly was the person in that file, then the situation on the range had just become far more serious than anyone else realized. Marcus Reed closed the laptop slowly, the quiet click of the lid sounding far louder in the cramped trailer than it should have. For a moment he remained seated, staring at the dull metal wall in front of him while the weight of the discovery settled deeper in his thoughts. Outside, the range had resumed its normal rhythm. Marines moved equipment, checked rifles, and spoke with the easy confidence of people who believed the day would unfold exactly as planned. Captain Ryan Walker's voice carried above the others now and then, calm and assured as he prepared the next firing rotation. None of them had any idea what Reed had just read. Reed stood up and stepped toward the trailer door. When he pushed it open, the bright California sunlight spilled across the dusty floor, bringing with it the dry scent of warm earth and gun oil. The range stretched wide and quiet beneath the sky, wind flags shifting in slow, unpredictable patterns across nearly a mile of training ground. Near the fence line, the old man still stood exactly where Reed remembered him, hands resting loosely in his jacket pockets, his gaze following the movement of the air as though the wind itself were speaking directly to him. The Marines around Captain Walker continued their relaxed chatter, a few of them still smiling about the unusual visitor who had claimed a call sign that sounded like something from an old legend. Reed walked back toward the firing line at a measured pace, his eyes never leaving the old man. Up close, the details were clearer now. The worn jacket, the steady posture, the quiet awareness in his eyes that seemed to take in everything happening across the entire range at once. Reed felt the uneasy certainty growing stronger in his chest. The photograph in the archive might have been taken 40 years earlier, but the man standing by the fence carried the same calm presence described in that report. Reed stopped beside the equipment table where the spotting scopes rested. Captain Walker glanced toward him briefly. "Everything ready, Sergeant?" the captain asked. Reed nodded automatically, but his attention was still fixed on the old man a short distance away. For a few seconds Reed considered simply walking over and asking the question directly, but something in the man's quiet composure made him hesitate. If the record he had read was accurate, the visitor standing near the fence was not just an old Marine wandering onto a training range. He was someone whose name still existed inside the archived history of the Corps itself. Reed knew the correct step now. This situation was above the authority of anyone standing on the range that morning. He stepped back toward the communications console mounted beside the equipment rack and reached for the secure base phone attached to it. The device was rarely used for anything more serious than scheduling adjustments between training units, but Reed knew exactly which extension to call. He dialed the operations desk at the command office across the base. The line rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Operations Center. Reed lowered his voice slightly, his eyes still watching the old man near the fence. This is Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed on range. Charlie, he said carefully. I need verification on a historical call sign. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Go ahead. Reed took a steady breath before speaking the words again. Iron Viper. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute, stretching several seconds longer than Reed expected. When the voice returned, its calm tone had changed in a way that made Reed's grip tighten slightly on the phone receiver. Staff Sergeant, the officer said slowly, repeat that call sign. Reed did not look away from the old man, standing quietly beside the range. Iron Viper, he said again. Another pause followed, deeper this time, as though the operations officer had just stood up from his chair. When the voice finally returned, it carried a new urgency that had not been there before. Staff Sergeant Reed, the officer said carefully, do not let that individual leave the range. Marcus Reed held the phone to his ear for a moment longer after the line went silent, the final words from the operations officer still echoing in his thoughts. Do not let that individual leave the range. Slowly he lowered the receiver back onto its cradle. The world outside the equipment station looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes earlier, yet the entire atmosphere of the morning had shifted in a way only Reed seemed to notice. The Marines around the firing line continued preparing for their next training cycle, checking magazines, adjusting optics, and joking with each other under the bright California sun. Captain Ryan Walker stood near the center of the group, giving instructions with the relaxed authority of someone completely confident in his control of the situation. And only 30 yards away, the old man remained by the fence line, watching the wind flags like a quiet observer studying a language everyone else had forgotten how to read. Reed stepped away from the phone console and returned to the equipment table beside the spotting scopes. His movements were steady, but his thoughts were racing. The tone in the operations officer's voice had been unmistakable. That was not the reaction of someone hearing an amusing story from a training range. That was the reaction of someone who had just confirmed the presence of a name that should not have appeared in a routine call. Reed glanced again toward the old man. The visitor had not moved more than a few feet since the conversation with Captain Walker. His eyes were still scanning the long stretch of open ground as the wind flags flickered in subtle shifts that the electronic weather meters attached to the Marines' vests still struggled to interpret. A few of the younger Marines laughed again as one of them repeated the call sign mockingly, drawing another round of amused smiles from the group. Captain Walker shook his head with a grin, clearly ready to return everyone's focus to the exercise schedule. Reed felt the tension building quietly behind his calm expression. He understood exactly what the operations officer had meant. Whatever was about to happen next would not come from the training chain of command. It would come from much higher. Across the base, nearly 2 miles away inside the command operations center, a senior officer had already stood up from his desk the moment the name was repeated through the secure phone line. The Iron Viper file had not been completely forgotten. It had simply been placed deep enough in the archives that only a handful of people still recognized it when it resurfaced. The officer who had answered Reed's call was one of them. Within seconds of ending the conversation, he had turned toward the communications console behind him and issued a quiet but urgent message to the command staff. The information moved through the building quickly, passing from operations to the executive desk and then directly to the office of the base commander. When the final confirmation reached the senior officer inside that office, the reaction was immediate. The commander pushed his chair back and stared at the report in front of him for several seconds before speaking a single calm order to his aide. Prepare transport. Back on range Charlie, None of that movement was visible yet. The Marines continued their routine preparations under the rising heat of the morning sun. Only Marcus Reed stood quietly beside the equipment table with the growing certainty that the calm visitor near the fence had just triggered a response that would soon change the entire atmosphere of the range. The morning continued under a bright and cloudless sky, but the rhythm of the range was beginning to shift in subtle ways that most of the Marines had not yet noticed. Captain Ryan Walker clapped his hands once and gestured toward the firing line, his voice carrying across the gravel with practiced authority as he organized the next drill rotation. Marines moved into position, adjusting equipment and exchanging quick jokes while the wind continued to twist the flags along the training field. To them, the visitor by the fence had already become little more than a brief distraction, another small story to laugh about during a long day of exercises. Only Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed kept watching the old man closely. The stranger had not reacted to the earlier laughter, nor to the curious glances still coming from the younger Marines. Instead, he remained exactly where he had been, standing with quiet patience as his eyes followed the slow dance of air currents across nearly a mile of open ground. Reed noticed something then that the others missed. The old man tilted his head slightly toward the far end of the range, as though he had heard something before anyone else did. At first, Reed heard nothing beyond the usual background sounds of the bass. Then, faintly, the distant thump of rotor blades began to roll across the air. The sound was low and steady, growing louder with each passing second. Several Marines looked up instinctively toward the sky. A dark shape appeared beyond the hills at the far edge of the base perimeter, moving quickly across the bright horizon. Within moments, the helicopter came into clear view, its rotor blades flashing in the sunlight as it descended toward the training grounds. The unexpected arrival drew immediate attention from everyone on the range. Walker stepped forward, shading his eyes as he watched the aircraft approach. Helicopters occasionally passed over the training areas, but this one was not simply passing by. The aircraft angled directly toward Range Charlie, lowering altitude with deliberate precision. Dust began to lift from the ground as the helicopter settled into a controlled descent beyond the observation line. Marines stepped back instinctively while the wind from the rotor wash spread across the range in a sudden wave of warm air and swirling dust. The helicopter touched down roughly 50 yards from the equipment station. For a brief moment, the entire range fell quiet except for the steady thunder of spinning blades. Reed felt the confirmation settle heavily in his chest. The response from command had arrived faster than he expected. Captain Walker stared at the aircraft with visible confusion as the side door opened and a uniformed officer stepped down onto the training ground. The man wore the insignia of a major general on his collar, the rank unmistakable even from a distance. Conversations across the range stopped immediately. Marines straightened instinctively as the senior officer began walking across the gravel toward the firing line with calm and purposeful steps. The only person who did not seem surprised was the old man by the fence. He had already turned slightly toward the approaching helicopter before it even landed, his expression unchanged as though the arrival of a general on a training range was the most ordinary thing in the world. Reed watched as the major general moved steadily across the field, ignoring the stunned looks of the Marines, and walking directly toward the quiet figure near the fence line. The rotor blades of the helicopter continued to turn slowly behind the landing zone as the Major General walked across the dusty ground with steady and deliberate steps, the insignia on his uniform catching the sunlight with every movement. Marines across the range had already straightened instinctively, their earlier laughter gone as the unexpected arrival settled over the training field like a sudden shift in weather. Captain Ryan Walker stood near the firing line with a confused expression, trying to understand why a general officer had just landed directly in the middle of his routine exercise. But the answer became clear almost immediately when the general did not stop near the command position or the equipment station. Instead, he continued walking across the gravel until he stood only a few feet away from the quiet figure near the fence line. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved gently across the open range, stirring the flags along the training field, while dozens of Marines watched in complete silence. Then the Major General removed his cover slowly and straightened his posture. The gesture alone caused several Marines nearby to exchange stunned glances because senior officers did not remove their covers casually on an active training range. The general's voice was calm when he finally spoke. "Sir," he said with quiet respect, "it is an honor to see you again." The old man studied him for a moment with the same calm expression he had carried all morning. There was no surprise in his face, only a faint recognition, as though he had expected this moment to happen eventually. "You have done well," the old man replied quietly. His voice carried just far enough across the still air for the closest Marines to hear it. The general gave a small nod, almost like a student acknowledging a teacher. "We still study your field reports at Quantico," he said. "They are required reading." A ripple of disbelief moved through the Marines standing along the firing line. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed remained still beside the equipment table, watching the scene unfold with the quiet confirmation he had been expecting ever since he opened the archive file. Captain Walker, however, had not moved at all. The earlier confidence had drained from his face as he tried to process what he was witnessing. The general turned slightly then, glancing toward the assembled Marines before his eyes settled briefly on the captain. "Captain," he said calmly. Walker snapped to attention instantly. "Sir." The general gestured lightly toward the quiet man beside the fence. "Do you know who you were speaking to earlier?" Walker hesitated, his mind racing through the events of the morning. The old call sign echoed faintly in his memory, now with a meaning he had not understood before. "No, sir," he admitted. The general studied him for a moment before answering. "The man standing beside you trained some of the reconnaissance doctrines your unit still practices today," he said. "Many of the methods we teach about reading terrain and wind patterns originated from his reports." The silence across the range deepened. Walker felt the weight of the realization settle heavily in his chest as he slowly turned his eyes toward the old Marine. The quiet visitor had already returned his attention to the wind flags moving gently across the training field. For him, the moment seemed to carry no importance at all. After a few seconds, he spoke again, his voice calm and almost reflective as he watched the shifting air currents across the distant hills. "Wind is changing again," he said softly. The Major General followed his gaze toward the far end of the range where the flags had indeed begun to tilt in a new direction. Then the general straightened once more and spoke clearly enough for every Marine present to hear. "Marines," he said, "you just met the man whose call sign still appears in our historical training doctrine." The wind moved across the open field again, carrying the quiet words across the silent training ground. And for the first time that morning, not a single Marine laughed.